So a few months back, there was a new movie that came out called Yes Day. And I don't know if you saw it, but it sounded like an interesting idea. The trailer pretty much gives away the whole story. But my wife and I, we watched it and decided to show it to our kids. It's a family that was having conflict. The kids were just tired of all the rules. They said the parents were no fun. And so they decided to give the kids a yes day. And so basically they told the kids, we're going to say yes to everything for one day. And they had to plan it out. They had to budget for it. There were certain stipulations, like you can't blow up the house and things like that. Although they did try before the end of the movie, if you watch it, and it's in the trailer, you can see it happen. But it starts off like most stories. It was fun. They did some paintball wars with each other, and they went to a car wash and made the parents roll down the windows, which I'm like, that is not in the stipulations of my yes day at all. Maybe car washes are so advanced they don't do that anymore, but I'm pretty sure I would get wet. And the interior would get wet, and that's more important. But they gave them a yes day, but by the end of it, you get to the conflict. They got in over their heads. They planned a surprise party with their parents not there. Their younger kids did that. The older kid sneaks off to a concert, gets in trouble. Lots of things happen. By the end, the parents swoop in, help save the day. They reconcile with the kids. And the kids realize they were in over their heads, and they're glad that their parents actually have some rules, because it probably wouldn't be good to live on a yes day all the time. So we show it to our kids, and they immediately asked, can we have a yes day? And we said yes, and they said, can it start now? And we're like, no. I should have said yes. It was like 8 o'clock at night. That would have probably been a smart thing. They said, okay. I said, no, you need to plan and prepare first. Okay, can it be tomorrow? We're like, no. And then they forgot about it for a while, and they bring it up every few weeks, and we've been kind of putting it away through that. But it would not be good if my kids had a yes day every day. I'm pretty sure after about a week or two of pancakes for breakfast, pizza for lunch, gummy snacks in the middle of everything. Like when we go back to home and our grandparents are involved, they feed them certain foods and they love it, and then they give them back to us. And I kind of describe my kids after they've been back in Mississippi with my parents like a college student. They come back exhausted and they've eaten terribly for the last week, and then they have to come in and kind of detox for a few days. And it's interesting, but we all know there needs to be limits, but as a kid growing up, I didn't like having the rules. There were times where I thought I had a better plan than my parents. This didn't seem fair. And so I made the same threat that most kids said, I'm leaving. And this was the 80s, so they said, sure, see how that goes for you. You were allowed to say that back then. I don't think you can get away with it now. But Mom had just cooked dinner. I'm like, I really would like to have dinner. And then, you know what? That bed sure is soft. I'm not sure I'm ready to get on that boxcar and travel the world, a seasoned 8-year-old that I am. And so I realized it was probably better just to stay home. But, there's times where we have those rules, we don't like it. Sometimes we threw a tantrum, and we weren't happy. And today we're going to see where the people of Israel basically throw a tantrum at God. They didn't like how God was leading them. They thought they had a better plan than God did. And because of that, they want to change who's in charge. And so we're in a series in 1 Samuel named Prophets, Priests, and Kings. We're switching from an age of the judges like Gideon and Samson, Deborah and Barak. Those were the judges, and now they're moving into, today we're going to see them request an actual king. Now, they had a king. God was their king. They were a theocracy, but they said, we want a king like everybody else. We want somebody from us, from among us, to lead us. We think we can do a better job than you're doing. And at some points, I kind of think they might have been right at first glance, and we're going to see that today. But this is one of the low points in the life of Israel in the book. And you might think, well, how does this apply to us? Where's the relevance? But when we've been looking at this series, we've seen real people with the same problems we have, unfulfilled hopes, praying and not feeling like we're getting an answer, seeing answered prayers and how to celebrate in the midst of that, learning what discipline is. There's all kinds of things we've already seen. And today we're going to see, maybe you've been there where you thought you had a plan that was better than God's. You didn't like God's plan. Maybe you're in the midst of one of God's plans right now and you don't like it. You're like, God, this can't be the best plan. I've got a few ideas for you. I've made a PowerPoint. I can show you all the ways this is wrong and how this would be a better plan. If you're in that today, we're going to see a little bit about God's view on that and how to respond. And we're going to see that they didn't respond the best way. But I do think it makes application wherever you're at in life, whether you're in school or you're retired or somewhere in between, because it gets to the heart really does literally get to the heart. Who is on the throne of our heart? Who is our king? And we're going to see what they requested in 1 Samuel chapter 8. So I invite you to turn there. Some of the scriptures will be on the screen as well. I'm going to look at a couple of verses at the beginning of the chapter and kind of fill in the middle and then come to the end as we look at this. But if you're just joining us, where we're picking up in Samuel is the books Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1 Samuel. So the judges came right before this time. The last of the judges were Eli, and then there was a man, Samuel, and we've been studying the life of Samuel and his mom, Hannah, and how she prayed for him, and then he enters into the priesthood. But Eli was one of the judges right before Samuel, but he had two sons, it says in chapter 2, that were worthless. They were abusing their power as priests. They were taking advantage of the people, not just taking advantage of the worship and saying, if you don't give us these offerings before you cook it, we want the best cuts of meat before you burn it on the altar. We're going to take it by force. They were doing things with the women at the tent of meeting. None of this was good. It says they did not know the Lord. They knew about God, but they didn't know God. And how many times are we in danger of people saying, yeah, they know a lot about God, but do they truly know him? Because it changes how we respond. Well, because of that, God says, I'm going to cut them off. And 2 weeks ago, we looked at that. Chapters 4 through 7 really fill us in on that. They start off by being under attack by the Philistines, one of those groups that keeps showing back up every couple of decades. They would rebuild after Samson had kind of decimated them as one of the judges. They come back now, they're attacking. And so the people decide, we've got this lucky charm we can use, this magical thing that we can take out there. We'll take the Ark of the Covenant out before us. And that way God has to win the battle for us, because he wouldn't let the Ark, lose a battle, right? And so they put Eli's two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, they carried out the Ark. And the Philistines obliterate them, kill the sons, take the Ark. When Eli hears of it that day, when they run back and tell him, he is old and heavy, it says, and he fell back and he broke his neck when he fell off his chair. And that was the end of that time with him. But we ended on a high note in that time, because chapters 4 through 7, the Ark now goes to the Philistine land. They take it to their capital city. They put it in front of their god, Dagon, and they're like, this is a trophy for him. The next day they come in, the head's been lopped off, the hands are down, he's laying down prostrate in front of them the next day, and a plague breaks out. And they say, hey, let's take it to the next city. So they take it to the next city, and it keeps happening. And God decimates the Philistines. Something the army couldn't do in their own power, right? God does it without the help of their army. He's showing his power just simply by doing that. And so they give it back. They're like, here, you can take your ark back. And when they get the ark back, they were still under attack from the Philistines. They said to Samuel, who is now the new judge, the last of the judges, what should we do? He says, return to God, the one who brought you out of Egypt. Get rid of your Asherah poles and your high places. That meant they were sacrificing their animals, potentially their children, and they were doing things with cult prostitutes that didn't honor God with their life. That's who they were worshiping instead of God. It was rampant in the land. He says, return to God and God alone. And they did. They went into battle against the Philistines. They finish off the Philistines. They don't hear from them for a long time. And it's a high note. We end on this high note where they're back with God. But as we've seen through the book of Judges, there's a cycle. A generation goes by and they're starting to get tired of hearing those stories of what their dad experienced, and they want to see a change. And so we pick up with that as now we're seeing that Samuel is now old. So we're not sure how long has passed, but at least a generation has passed at this point. And that's what it tells us twice in this, that Samuel is old, and it talks about his sons, starting in verse 1. It says, when Samuel became old, he made his sons judges over Israel. The name of the firstborn son was Joel, and the name of his second, Abijah. They were judges in Beersheba, and yet his sons did not walk in his ways, but turned aside after gain. It says they took bribes and they perverted justice. Now, that sounds like chapter 2. Wait a minute. That was Eli's sons. Eli got old. He handed off his power to his two sons who took advantage of the people. And now we see Samuel, who watched this happen and saw the judgment that happened on Eli and his sons. But his sons are now perverting that same justice. They're taking bribes. The very ones that were sent to judge the people were not showing justice. And as a result, the people get fed up. And rightfully so. That's not how it should have been. So look at what happens. Verse 4, it says, then the elders of Israel gathered together, and they came to Samuel at Ramah, and they said to him, making sure it's keeping track with me. Sometimes it doesn't follow suit. I want you to be able to keep up with me. There we go. Behold, You are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint for us a king like all the nations. They start off, you're old, and your sons are not walking in your ways. So appoint for us a king to judge us like all the nations. So we're going to come back to that. That's the request today. And we're going to see a little bit about why was that the request. Yes, I get the sons were bad, but why switch from judges? Give us a new judge? No, they said give us a king. We're ready to be like all the other nations. Well, this thing, of course, displeased Samuel, that they said give us a king to judge us. And Samuel prayed to the Lord. And the Lord said to Samuel, obey the voice of the people and all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. According to all the deeds that they have done from the day I brought them up out of Egypt, even to this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so they are also doing to you. So now obey their voice, only you shall solemnly warn them and show them the ways of the king who shall reign over them. So we'll stop right there for a second as we unpack this. The people wanted a king. But think about this. There were good reasons to want a change in leadership. The sons were corrupt. They were perverting justice. I was looking at this. At first glance, you're like, they wanted a king. But look at how the leaders were doing. But they weren't just wanting a change in leadership. They were wanting a change in style of leadership. They were wanting not just a new judge. They wanted a king. And they say it like everybody else. In fact, God says, they've not rejected you. They've rejected me. And so warn them. So he warns them for the next couple of verses. That's what he tells them he's going to do. I'm not going to put it on the screen, but just real quickly, starting in verse 10, going all the way to verse 18, it says, you don't understand what a king will do to you. He's going to take your people. He's going to put some in the army. He's going to have some plow his fields. He's going to take your best vineyards and give them to his lieutenants. He's going to put some of you, basically enslave you. He's going to take your daughters and make them bakers and chefs and perfumers. He says, it's going to be like the time in Egypt. He's going to make you slaves to him, and he's going to build his power up. And he says at the very end, and in that day you will cry out because of your king whom you have chosen for yourselves, but the Lord will not answer you in that day. This is what they responded to with that. But the people said, no, there shall be a king over us, that we may be like all the other nations, and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. Now that's going to be a key verse that we'll come back to in a second, because that's found in another place as well. And so the Lord said to Samuel, obey their voice, make them a king. Oh, he repeated them in the ears of the Lord, and he said, obey their voice, make them a king. And so he called the men of Israel and go to every man to his city. So next week we'll see the picking of the first king. Spoiler alert, it's Saul. And we're going to see how he's exactly what they asked for. He was a head taller than everybody else. He was a charismatic leader. He had everything going for him on the outside. And so they get exactly what they asked for. But the question is, was it a good thing that they got what they asked for? And we're going to see this was not a picture of God being, blessing them. This was judgment on them. He gave them what they wanted. There have been times where God has given us what we wanted, and that was actually judgment, because we thought we had a better plan. And it was to show us this isn't a better plan. This is not what you want, but I'm going to let you see and learn from this. And so as we look at this, we'll continue to unpack that. But as we think about this, they said they wanted a king like all the nations. And they said they wanted a king, and the second half, that judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. That's the key here. They were insecure about the other armies around them. It wasn't just that there were leaders that were corrupt. They wanted to switch leadership styles. There's times where we're like, I don't like what's going on. I need a fresh start. So we just try to change everything. They were just wanting a fresh start. And sometimes maybe you've done that. I just want to change everything. I'm going to switch jobs. I'm going to do this. And it may not fix the problem that at the root of what you're dealing with, but at least it's different, right? That's where we get to. And in this, there is a passage, Deuteronomy 31:8. Remember, it said, we want a king that will judge us, go out before us, and fight our battles. In Deuteronomy, God actually talks about there's a day coming when you'll have a king. You'll ask for a king, and there's going to be an anointed king that we long for and look toward to. Now we see as Jesus and understand him as our king. But he was already telling them back when the law was given, there's a day coming when you get into the land, you're going to want a king. And we'll come back to some of that. But verse 31:8 says, it is the Lord who goes before you. Before the king was there, the Lord was to go before them. He will be with you. He will not leave you or forsake you. Do not be feared or dismayed. Before a king was ever to come, God was the one that fought their battles. And now they're saying we want a king, an earthly king, someone to lead us to fight our battles. They were seeing maybe a buildup of the Philistines again. There was peace among the Amorites. There was another group. There were all these different groups all around them. And they saw they had war parties. They had commanders. They had generals. They had kings. But God had given specific instructions about the kind of king they should have. I'm not going to read all of it, but in Deuteronomy chapter 17, you can read all of this, verses 14 through 20. He says, when you come into the land and you possess it, when you ask for a king, here's what should qualify the king. And it says things like, he must not acquire many horses for himself. And you should not cause the people to return to Egypt in order to acquire many horses. You shall never return to that. He shall not acquire many wives for himself, lest his heart turn away. And you look at the kings that follow to this, people like Solomon with wives and concubines and being turned away from worshiping God, because when they would marry another woman from another king, it was a treaty. But they would bring their own gods in and they would start to tempt the people to worship their gods. And we see that all throughout the kings. He says that he shall not acquire him for himself excessive silver and gold. And when he sits on the throne, he shall write for himself a copy of the law. And he will read it every day. And it will be with him. And he will learn to fear God in keeping these things. And it says, in doing so, verse 20, that his heart may not be lifted above his brothers. The king was meant to serve. The king was not about lifting himself up and building his empire, but that's exactly what the kings did. They taxed the people and they took some of their best land and gave it to their commanders. They kept some for themselves. They built lavish temples. They took extra wives. I mean, even David, a man after God's own heart, we see him doing some of those very things that they're called not to do. He meditated on the law, but he also looked at Bathsheba and decided he wanted to be with her and kills her husband, tries to cover it up. There's all kinds of a mess that we see even in David's life. David wasn't that coming anointed king that they were longing for. He still comes up short. And that's what we find all throughout the Old Testament is people will let you down. If you place your hope in a king, he will let you down. You place your hope in a politician, they will let you down. If it's a role model, an athlete, someone in social media, they're going to let you down. But we want to place someone like that and say, I'm going to do what they do. They started the carnivore diet, so I only eat meat now. Next week, they are vegan. I don't eat animals at all. You know, whatever they do, we want to do. We want to emulate them. We want to be like them. It's not exactly the same, but it's not very different either. We idolize and want to be like them in our culture. People get influenced that way. And then we end up buying their products that they're using, they're getting paid to promote. And so it's just being used by people to build themselves up. Do you catch that? Is the king there to build himself up or to be amongst the people? When God would do things, he's like, I do this not for my benefit, but for yours. So out of all that, they requested a king. So they had a good reason, I think, to ask for a change in leadership. But like the last time there was a change in leadership, let God bring judgment on the two sons and bring in another judge so that God could still be their king. But God says, they rejected not you, but me. They want a king. We're going to give it to them. And they wanted a king so they could fight their battles. And they weren't supposed to be about building themselves up, but that's exactly what we get. What happens is, basically, they end up working for a king and doing his bidding. Basically, they are doing what they were called to do in Egypt and forced to do, but now they just weren't in Egypt doing it. They were still beholden to someone. They were still in slavery to someone else instead of being set free with a God who is their king and dwells among them. And so it's a hard thing to look at. The hard part, the worst part, though, was they were choosing not to trust God in this. There's some pragmatic pictures there. It makes sense to get a change. There's corrupt leadership. But that part was right. But the way they went about it was, we've got a better plan than God. And that's one of the hardest things to do, is submitting to God's plan, even though it might not make sense when you tally it up and you put it on that PowerPoint. I'll never forget, in college, I was finishing up my last year of school, and there was a thing at Mississippi State called the co-op program. And the co-op program was, you would go in, you would interview with a bunch of companies like Lockheed Martin. I was an engineering degree. And so like Lockheed Martin would come in, certain businesses would come in, and you could pick who you wanted to interview with. And they would come just to the engineering students or to other groups. But I had like 7 interviews in 2 days. And they said, worst case, you get a lot of experience going through interviews. But on that first day, I went to an interview, and it was with a company, a paper company, and they were in South Alabama. They were within driving distance to Pensacola, low cost of living, and it just sounded like a good fit. Well, the next day, I went through some other interviews, but the next morning they called me first thing, and they said, hey, we want you. And we have a guy, he's our system administrator. He's going to be retiring in a couple of years. We'd like you to come in for the co-op program. You work a semester, go to school, so you come out with experience is what the co-op program did. But we would just like you to learn under him, and then after a few years he retires and you take his position. And they offered me the job. I remember where I was on Blackjack Road in Starkville, Mississippi, in the trailer I was renting, jumping up and down after I hung up that phone. This was great. Low cost of living, good pay, everything I wanted. This is the job. Systems analyst, that's what you wanted to get. But you were going to have to work for years to get up to that usually. So this was great. But I still had some other job interviews to do the next day. I had this state government job that was I was going to interview for, and a couple others I remember. But I went to them anyway, just for the experience. And I went through them, and I had a good interview with each group. But then the state government job called back and offered me a job too. And they said, think over the weekend. It was like a Thursday and a Friday. And so I made a mistake. I prayed about it. It wasn't really a mistake. But I'll tell you what happened. God took that piece away from that job that I thought was perfect. High pay, low cost of living. It was a family idea, so you didn't really dress up. The state government job, shirt and tie and khakis every day. That's a lot of ironing. I'm not sure I'm ready for that. Lower pay, cost of living in Jackson, Mississippi was higher. It didn't make sense. But God took away my peace. Amy and I prayed about it. Didn't make sense for her job. She was going to be a student teacher, and they didn't offer student teaching down in Jackson. They didn't offer it in South Alabama either, but that was one of those things. Is this really right for us? And I'll never forget, we went home that weekend, we're talking with the cousins, sitting around dinner, the grandparents are in the house, and everybody, we're sitting at the kids' table, so to speak, that's now grown up a little bit. And I remember telling them about these two job opportunities, and one of the cousins looked at me and says, you're crazy if you take that state government job over that job. That's perfect. I don't understand. And all I could say to him was, I can't wait to tell you one day, I don't understand it now, how God uses this, because I don't understand it either. And we stepped out in faith. They opened up Jackson, Mississippi for student teaching for Mississippi State for the first time that semester. And because Amy did it, they were like giving her like a boosted credit or something because they needed people to sign up to go there. My mom's best friend shows up out of nowhere, has a studio apartment behind her house. She's a doctor, and I paid for the phone bill, and I had low cost of living. I still had to wear a shirt and tie, but they gave me a pretty substantial raise. The first month I was there, it just happened to come through the government. And it was perfect. And then I went back there another semester, and that's where Amy and I found a church outside of Jackson, Mississippi, where we just fell in love with this church. We saw a live church. Like we'd been in a good church that loved people, but I saw a church that was alive. Small groups were thriving. They understood worship. The teaching was powerful. And it really changed a lot for us. And I could see now, it didn't make sense at the time, but that's helped me take other steps of faith. I had taken other steps of faith to get to that point till I was willing to go to Jackson, Mississippi. But it's those moments where do we trust God's plan or do we just put it on paper and say, whichever one makes the most sense, that's the one I'm going to do. Maybe we don't even pray about it because we don't want to know what he has to say. That's where we say, who's on the throne? Who's on the throne of our life? Because what they were saying was we don't want God to be on our throne. We want to be on our own throne by getting us a king that's like us. When you think about how that looks in our life, who is the king of our life? For many of us, it's the question of, is it Jesus or is it ourself? When you think about sin, the first sin and every sin after that has been about, do we trust God's plan or do we have a better plan? When Adam and Eve were tempted to eat the fruit, the enemy, Satan, says, if you eat it, you'll be like God. He's holding back from you. And they decided, you know what? God's not got the best plan. We're going to eat this fruit. We think we've got a better plan. Every sin after that is about, do we trust God's plan or are we going to do our plan? When Jesus was tempted in the wilderness, each one of those temptations were about taking shortcuts from God's plan. Turn that stone into bread because you're hungry. That's not what God wanted to do. Jump off the temple, then everybody will know who you are as the Messiah. That wasn't God's plan. He was going to be taking his road to the cross to show them an ultimate act of love. And so when you think about a king that builds himself up, or one like Jesus in Matthew 20:28, he said, the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many. That's my king. When he was brought before Pilate, he could find nothing against him. He knew there were trumped up charges. He stands before the people, the Jewish people, and said, shall I kill your king? And they said, we have no king but Caesar. Who's on the throne of our hearts? That's really the question today. When we make decisions, it tells us who's on the throne. Do we follow God's plan or do we make our own plan? Or do we try to somewhere stay in the middle? There were so many times the people of Israel tried to worship God and do their own thing, and it never ended well. If you've tried to do your own plan, you know that didn't work out for you as well as you'd hoped. We don't always understand it, but here's the thing. It's easier for predictability. Think about what the people were wanting. Stability. We have a king. We're going to have an army. We know we can fight the battles because we've seen it done by these other groups. It was safer because following this invisible God, I mean, I've heard the stories. He had them walk around one city 7 times to take that city. Other times there's this guy, Gideon, and they had like these jugs and they're hitting these lamps and they're doing all this crazy stuff. Like, it's so much easier just to follow the predictable. But God doesn't give us the predictable, does he? Because if that was the case, we wouldn't need to listen to him anymore. We just get our orders one time and I got it from here, God. But when we come back to hear that still small voice, when we come back to hear what he has to say and respond, that's when we really get to see he is our king. And he has shown us already by laying down his life for us. He, while we were still his enemies, laid down his life for us. When he wanted to show what leaders look like, he got on his hands and knees, put a towel around his waist, and washed his disciples' feet. And the most striking image, it was a few years ago when it hit me, he washed all the disciples' feet. Not just the 11 that were going to follow him and maybe run away. He washed Judas's feet, knowing he would betray him. That's real leadership. He loved him to the end. And he loved us while we were still his enemies. He died on the cross when we were not worthy, to make us worthy. And so who do we follow as our king today? That's the question. When we make a decision, do we even bring it to God, or there is a tendency or a temptation, because you're smart, you know it, you know how to do things. I'm going to do it my way, and if all else fails, then I'll call God. Kind of like a lifeline. Okay, it didn't work out. Now I'll talk to God instead of, God, can you help me with this decision? It seems like a small one, but your ways are not my ways, and I want to trust you in the midst of that. It's amazing to me. We talked about it at the beginning, how Hannah prayed, and God answers prayers, yes, no, and not yet. And sometimes we get the not yet, and we give up on praying and pressing in to see what God has to say before he ever says yes. We just take not yet as a no. So I don't know where you're at, taking a big decision, taking a big step, but I do know you can trust God to provide peace and answers in the midst of that when we press into who he is through his scripture, through prayer, through biblical community and counsel around us that are praying with us and for us. And that's when we see who's really our king. And so right now, that's what I want to invite you to do. Maybe you've never made that decision to follow Christ. And we say to follow Christ, we're saying, I want Jesus to be my king. I'm no longer going to try to run my own life. I'm going to trust God to take me where I need to go and tell me to stop when I need to stop. And I can rest and trust that he's a good king. And I've seen that lived out. And there's been times where I didn't understand it. I wanted to throw the tantrum and hit the road. But he's always been faithful. And when I did try those other things, I realized it wasn't so easy. It wasn't the best plan. And so maybe that helps keep us from going down that path today. Maybe you're thinking about going down a path. You know that does not line up with God's scripture in your life. Maybe it doesn't line up with your character. But you're going to do it anyway. Maybe this is your chance for a wake-up call to say it's always better to follow God's plan. And if you know what he's already communicated to you, let's follow him and trust him in that. So I'm going to invite you in a moment. I'm going to pray. And as we continue, after I pray, if you need to talk about following Jesus, I'm available in the back. Just come back and say, I want to become a Christian, or I want to follow Christ, and I'll know what you mean. If you're online, you can put Jesus in the comments or send a direct message, and I'll reach out to you. And we'll talk about what it means to follow Jesus. I go to church, I'm religious, I hope God loves me. Christ has already shown his love for us. Our King died on the cross, and not only died, but he rose again to conquer death and sin. And there's no need for guilt and shame anymore. We get a new life in Christ. And if you need help with that, come see me. And for all of us, it's a chance to respond. Maybe God's already answered some of those prayers in your life lately. You've seen his faithfulness, or you're in the midst of one and you remember his faithfulness today. Maybe that's where you're at, to remember those stories of how God's already been faithful. I've had to go back to that story about Jackson so many times. When things get tough, I have to remember God has been faithful. And maybe you need to hear that today. And he loves you, and he is faithful. So now we're going to pray and then worship our King a little bit more. God, I thank you for this time. God, I truly pray that if anybody has something on their throne besides you, God, I pray that you'd reveal that to them, make it clear. Speak to us right now. We are open. We want to hear from you. We want guidance. We want to follow your will. We want to know your will. So help us to know what's keeping us back from hearing you. Help us to know what's keeping us from following. I pray that you'd tear down any of those altars that are keeping us from you. And I pray that we would do it in such a way that only you get credit. It's in the strong name of Jesus we pray.